Hub Transport Server, Message Transport, Connectors, Accepted Domains, and Remote Domains. Okay, so we've pretty much at this point concluded at least the majority of our discussion on the client access server. At this point, you should recognize that there are multiple clients out there that can connect into an Exchange organization for the purposes of sending and receiving mail. Now, our entire conversation at this point is really centered around that single client connecting into more or less that single Exchange server. And really, we haven't really sent any mail. I mean, we saw an example of one piece of mail as a sort of a test message at this point, but really we haven't gotten to the process where we're really discussing how you can get a piece of mail sent from one user to the other. Now, in order to do that in an Exchange organization, you're going to rely on the Hub Transport Server. And the Hub Transport Server is, if I bring up my little architecture diagram here, the Hub Transport Server is that server that exists in one or more of your Active Directory sites, and it is really the central sort of hub of where all your mail ends up transferring through. If you send a piece of mail from one location to the other, that piece of mail will always run through the Hub Transport Server. And this is even the case if you're sending a piece of mail from one user on one mailbox database to another user on the same mailbox database. All pieces of mail, whether they're going outside of the organization, off into the internet, or remaining inside of the organization, are going to occur through that Hub Transport Server. Now, why do we have this? We have this central location, this hub, once again, of where mail transports through, so that we can provide a single location whereby policies can be applied to all pieces of mail, no matter where they're going. This is great for compliance. This is great for ensuring that you put your email disclaimer notices on pieces of mail. It's good for ensuring that you do journaling. It's good for really all of the reasons why you want to have a policy-driven approach to how you deal with mail. Now, just like the client access server, your Hub Transport Server here needs to exist in the same sites that you're going to have mailbox servers. You'll see here we have a Denver site here and a Las Vegas site. And we have two different Hub Transport servers. One of the other reasons why a Hub Transport Server is necessary is because a lot of times people will send out a piece of mail to multiple recipients. Let's say that you're sending out some sort of message to a large number of people, maybe to a distribution group. Now, the SMTP protocol by default is not a particularly optimized protocol for sending out very large quantities of mail at the same time. If you're using core SMTP, if you sent out a piece of mail to 5 different people, it would need to send out 5 different email messages. Well, the Hub Transport Server, one of the roles of that is when you send out a piece of email from that mailbox server, the Hub Transport Server can send that piece of email in just a single piece of email to, for example, a different Hub Transport Server, and then back to another set of mailbox servers before it gets distributed out. What this effectively does is it reduces the amount of network traffic that's required to process the mail across your entire organization. When you have a larger organization with lots of different sites, you'll find that Hub Transport Server really improves that performance because you don't have to keep sending large quantities of mail in a replicated sense from mailbox server to mailbox server. Now, the exciting thing about the way that Microsoft has implemented the Hub Transport Server is that inside of your Active Directory forest, when you're routing mail inside of that Active Directory forest, you're actually going to leverage your existing Active Directory sites and also that site link cost for how it's going to end up moving mail around that Active Directory forest. Now, in our little architecture diagram that we looked at before, we only had 2 sites, so there's really only one site link that's involved with those 2 sites. But you can imagine if your Active Directory forest had lots and lots of sites, that there would be sort of a mesh that was created of the individual sites and the costs associated with those individual sites. So you have to be conscious, and you have to be aware of those sites and how you've created those sites and the subnets associated with those sites, and then also the costs that are associated between the sites. Active Directory can do some of this work for you, but you may feel the need to tune some of that based off of the performance that you're seeing out of your Active Directory, just out of your mail throughput as you're going around through the different sites in your organization. Now, this gets you routing of mail inside of your Active Directory forest, but as we all know, well, email is designed to be able to go anywhere, and a lot of the emails you send on any particular day are going to go out to the internet to someone else in some other organization. Well, the other half of routing mail using the Hub Transport Server is involved with that sort of mail that happens outside of the Active Directory forest. And, well, that sort of mail and how that sort of mail is done is not really as conveniently easy as the inside the forest mail. You don't really have Active Directory sites between all the internet sites in the world. You have to use things like send connectors and receive connectors to identify how you're going to send mail out, the vector that you're going to use to send mail out, and then also where you're going to be listening to receiving mail in. Now, those send and receive connectors can be a part of an edge transport server and the subscription to that edge transport server. We'll talk about that as well. And also, you may be wanting to receive mail for different domains that are other than your primary domain. These are the concept of accepted domains and remote domains. So we're going to talk about that and how you can actually set up routing mail outside of your Active Directory forest through a number of different use cases. And then we're going to conclude with a little look at the QViewer utility here, because this QViewer utility will help you as you're going through that routing of mail. It will help you identify whether or not you've got the buildup of messages going on. For example, too many messages that are not getting routed fast enough. And it gives you just a nice look into the different queues and how well those queues are performing as they're passing the mail inside and outside of your organization. Well, the first thing we want to do, however, is talk about this process of routing mail inside of the Active Directory forest. Let's actually go ahead and bring up our server here. Here we have our server in the Exchange Management Console. And right now we're looking at the hub transport role here. We're taking a look at some of the different characteristics that we can set for that hub transport role that are associated with the organization, our Microsoft Exchange organization. Now, as you'll notice, none of these really have anything to do with routing of mail inside of your Active Directory forest. What you really need to take a look at is not necessarily here inside of the Exchange Management Console, but is back here in Active Directory Sites and Services. We were here already once before when we created that Denver site not too long ago. Now, one of the things we can talk about here is actually creating an additional site, that Las Vegas site, like we were discussing in the architecture diagram. Let's go ahead and create that Las Vegas site here, and we will connect that site via the default IP site, or the default IP site length with transport IP. Now down here we have this Las Vegas site. We currently have no servers in it, but we could potentially put a domain controller in that site a little later on. The other thing that we might want to do actually is create a subnet for that site. We'll call it 192.168-1-0/24. So instead of being the O.O subnet, this is going to be the 1.0 subnet that's associated with the Las Vegas site. Now, more or less, right now we have two sites, the Denver site and the Las Vegas site. And we have one site link that connects the two. This is this default IP site link here. If I take a look at the properties of this site link, you can see that these two sites are currently being connected via that site link, and they have a cost of 100. As the number of sites in your organization grows, you will probably be adding more sites and connecting those sites via site links. You may also be establishing costs associated with those site links if you have different connection speeds or throughputs for those sites. It is this process that will instruct Exchange how to route mail, because Exchange looks at these site links for determining, well, what are the costs associated with getting a piece of mail from this site to this site to this site. So be conscious once again of those Active Directory sites and services, and just make sure that your sites and subnets and links are all set appropriately, and then you'll ensure that you've got the best routing of mail inside of your Active Directory forest. Once again, this process really only gets you the routing of mail inside of your forest. You know, you probably really want to set up some sort of mechanism to get mail outside of that Active Directory forest as well, so you can email other people around on the internet. Now that is done using things like send connectors and receive connectors and all these different tabs up here. But I want to do something just a little bit different here. I want to, because there are so many different options that are available for doing message transport in Exchange 2010, I want to spend a little bit of time actually kind of going through the different possibilities that are out there so that you're at least comfortable with all of these different tabs. Now, we've already talked about the process of routing mail inside of the Active Directory forest and how that hub-to-hub routing within that Active Directory forest is going to use those AD sites. So that's kind of the easy part. But I want to spend just a minute or two kind of giving you the cheat sheet, if you will, associated with these different connectors and different things you have to be aware of as you're setting up your organization for routing mail out to the internet. First and foremost, there are two different connectors that are absolutely required for your Exchange organization to simply function with the rest of the world. The first is a send connector, and the second is a receive connector. Now, these should be pretty obvious. A send connector creates a logical connection to some sort of remote email system for the purposes of sending mail outbound. Now, you may have perhaps some sort of device sitting on your DMZ, sitting on your edge. You may have some sort of Unix box or Linux box. You may have a mail provider that takes care of routing mail once it leaves your organization and then out to the rest of the world. Whatever device that you are using to finish the routing of mail, or I guess I should say to begin the routing of mail to the internet, that's going to be the device at the other side of a send connector. You will need to enter in information about that connector and about its location on the network and other elements so that your Exchange organization knows where to send mail out to. Now, this is very different than a receive connector. A receive connector works in the opposite direction. It serves as more or less the logical gateway in which all of your inbound messages are received. So your send connector is used to send mail, and your receive connector is used to receive mail. That receive connector essentially listens for inbound connections that match specific settings. What's interesting about these receive connectors is that you can actually set different types of receive connectors, and you can order the receive connectors based off of different characteristics. Maybe you want to receive off of a certain span of IP addresses for one connector and a different span of IP addresses for another connector. Maybe you want to create one receive connector for non-MAPI clients and another receive connector for other hub and edge transport servers. Now, by default, two receive connectors are created. One that is referred to as a client connector for those SMTP connections from your typical classic non-MAPI clients, again PAP and IMAP. The default receive connector is used for connections from other hub and edge transport servers. This is sort of for the same sort of routing that is done here inside of an Active Directory forest. You have to have both of these connectors. So really, you kind of have to have three connectors, one send connector and two receive connectors to be fully recognized and fully functional as an Exchange organization. Now, you can actually use what's called an edge subscription if the device that you're using for sending mail is an edge transport server. And we haven't talked about edge transport servers yet. But if you use an edge transport server as that device that's sending mail outbound, well, you can use an edge subscription to actually create some of these connectors for you. And we're going to talk about this whole process of edge transport servers and some of these edge subscriptions in a later nugget when we talk about that edge transport role. Also, there are these concepts of accepted domains and remote domains. And these are very important too here, especially as the complexity of your organization, as the complexity of really your business goes up. An accepted domain is used to define which SMTP domains that Exchange will accept for inbound email routing, right? These are essentially other domains, maybe different than your primary domain, that Exchange recognizes and then will use for sending that email off to someone in your organization. Now, we're using the nuggetlab.com domain, right? So gshields@nuggetlab.com is the address that is being used for routing mail inbound. But perhaps maybe nuggetlab.com goes and buys contoso.com someday, and you want a single Exchange organization for all of the accounts in nuggetlab.com and contoso.com. Well, this is an example where you might use an accepted domain to actually create that secondary listener for listening for those contoso.com emails and then correctly routing those to the right mailbox and to the right user inside of your organization. A remote domain is a little bit different than an accepted domain. A remote domain is a situation where you have an SMTP domain that's external to your Exchange organization. Maybe it's outside your forest. Maybe it's a different company that you don't want to share your Exchange organization with. But you do want to share certain components of your email system with. A remote domain allows you to define settings for transferring messages between your Exchange organization and some other domain and forest outside of your own Active Directory forest. You may do these again if you have two organizations that perhaps haven't completely merged their IT infrastructures yet. You want to be able to route your messaging over to that server without having to go out and around to the internet and back. You may want to include things like FreeBSD information or other sort of more rich information with those remote domains. And that's why you would create these remote domains today. Now, use this as your cheat sheet. As I said, some of these are somewhat complicated in the way they're set up, and at least to me, it seems useful to kind of get an understanding of all these particular options are before we launch directly into all these little tabs here, because there's a lot of tabs here with which to look at. At this point, what I want to do is take what we've learned here in this little cheat sheet and actually show you how this actually works here within the Hub Transport role. Now, as I had said earlier, one of the first things that you absolutely have to have is some sort of way of sending mail outside of your Exchange organization. And that is done by creating a send connector. By default, there are no send connectors that are created, so you have no way of routing mail outside of your organization by default. You actually have to go and create a new send connector by right-clicking and choosing New Send Connector. There are a lot of different ways that you can create a connector. Because there are a lot of different devices that are out there that can potentially route mail. That can be, again, an appliance that sits in your DMZ. That can be a Linux box that sits in your DMZ. That can be a Windows server running SMTP sitting in your DMZ. For a lot of us, the entity that actually handles routing of our mail outside of our organization is our service provider. And so that service provider handles some of the work for us. And so here inside of the send connector properties, we need to create that send connector. So we'll call this our send connector, just to give it a title. And then we have a couple of different types of send connectors that we can create. The first is an internal send connector, and internal send connectors are used to send email to servers inside of your Exchange organization. Okay, this is if you have a smart host sitting out there. You can also have internet send connectors. Now this is designed to send email to the internet, and it uses your available MX records actually to send those emails out. And lastly, we have a partner connection here. And these are used when you have an established TLS connection, so some sort of pipeline that's been created between you and some other partner domain for actually sending mail to that partner domain. Okay, the most common of these is really going to be an internet connection, because most of us are going to be using these to actually create some sort of connection out to whatever our service provider is, or whatever that device is that's actually going to route mail outside of this organization. When we do that, we need to specify an address space to which this connector will route mail. Most of the time, the address space that you're going to use is the star address space. You'll notice here, star essentially says, I want to route all SMTP mail, every single bit of it, and even all the subdomains, out via this send connector. Right? Most of us do not necessarily say, okay, for this domain name, I'm going to send it out a different connector. Most of us say, I'm going to send everything out one pipeline, and then we just let them deal with it on the other side. But you have the ability of actually doing specific different addresses here. If you want to set, contoso.com, you could potentially set contoso.com out this connector also, or even create a different connector if you wanted to. But for the most part here, you're going to just set star because you're going to route all of your mail outside using this connector. And you're going to use either a smart host, meaning that you've already created or been given some information about a smart host that's going to handle the routing of mail for you, or you're going to use your existing DNS MX records to route that mail. In a lot of cases, this is already set up for you, or this is at least already, the information is at least given to you from your provider or from the device owner that's actually routing that mail. Okay, so in this case, let's just choose our MX records here to route those mail out. We need to associate this send connector with one of the Hub Transport servers. One of those Hub Transport servers will have the job of sending that mail out. In this case, because we only have one, it's going to be EX1 Nugget. You could potentially, add additional Hub Transport servers if you wanted to, but we're just going to use this Hub Transport server for routing mail outbound. Click the next button here and new, and that will create that send connector. Now, obviously, you are going to have the correct MX records in your DNS, because we're using that for the mechanism for actually dealing with routing of mail. This is a good idea because you're probably going to have to keep those updated if you're going to be, making changes down the road, those sorts of things. So be very conscious about making sure you have the correct records, and again, mail records inside of your DNS to support this send connector. Now, send connectors are done on an organizational basis, but the receive connectors are done actually down here on each individual server. You can see here for EX1 Nugget, there are actually these two receive connectors that have been created, the client and the default connector. Recall that the client connector is used for SMTP connections from non-MAPI clients like POP and IMAP, and the default is used for connections from other hub and edge transport servers. Now, a lot of us, at least on the inbound mail, are probably going to be getting our mail in from some sort of other solution. It may not necessarily be from another hub transport server. It may be from an edge transport server, but at this point, let's take a look at the client receive connector so we can get a feel for actually what are the configurations we need to be aware of. Now, this is the properties of that client connector here. We've got it a name, obviously. We can set the logging level if we want, if we're having some problems. We can specify the fully qualified domain name this connector will provide when another server attempts to connect to it. That's what HELO or EHLO is. And then also what our maximum message size is going outbound. If you want to limit the size of your messages, those that are going out to the internet, you can do that here. Or I guess I should say those that are coming in from the internet, you can do that here and ensure that really ridiculously large size messages are going to get blocked before they even come into your organization. Here under Network, we identify the local IP addresses that will be used to receive mail. You may want to specify those specific IP addresses if you have more than one that's attached to your hub transport server. And then also you may want to set what range of IP addresses you want to receive mail from. Now, in rare situations, you may need to create additional receive connectors if you want to separate out where you're receiving mail traffic from. So if you know you're receiving mail traffic from a partner company or some other entity out there that you want to send through a different receive connector, you want to apply different policies to it, you can do that here and edit out this start and end address here. Most of us are probably simply going to have a single connection that we're going to be listening across, and that's probably, again, coming from our mail provider, and that we'll be receiving mail from all of those remote servers. We don't care. Okay. You may also want to limit this down, again, if you're using some sort of smart host that's sending mail in and you have a single connection that's receiving mail in from one location. Again, this is going to be based off of some of the design elements of your Exchange organization and how you end up designing that whole organization from scratch. When you're looking at this receive connector, there are a couple different ways that you can define the security, essentially the authentication from the outbound coming in. Obviously, we don't want to have some sort of situation where we've got an open relay. Right? Open relays are bad because open relays, well, they can send mail out and anybody can bounce mail off of our SMTP server. So you're probably going to want to set up some sort of security mechanism for those incoming connections using transport layer security, basic authentication, Exchange server, integrated Windows authentication, for example, what have you. So these are the authentication mechanisms you'll use. The options are out there. In a lot of cases, these authentication mechanisms will be defined by, again, the device that's on the other side. Lastly, some permission groups. Who is allowed to connect to this receive connector? Is it Exchange users, Exchange servers, legacy Exchange servers, partners, what have you? Okay, so this determines who is going to be able to connect to this receive connector and make use of it. Over here on the other side with the default one, again, this is the one that's used by other hub transport servers and edge transport servers. Same set of settings here, same network settings, same authentication settings, same permission groups here. However, you'll notice that Exchange servers are actually allowed to use this connector because, well, you're coming in through hub transport and edge transport servers. Okay, so these are what you need to be aware of when it comes to those receive connectors and how you'll configure those receive connectors for receiving mail into your Exchange organization. Now, as I had said, sometimes there comes a situation where you need to actually receive mail for different domains than what are your primary domain. That's done here under accepted domains. By default, when you create an Exchange organization, it creates the domain you provide for it, your Active Directory domain. It creates that as an accepted domain. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to, well, receive mail authoritatively from that domain. So you have to have at least one accepted domain in there, and this is this nuggetlab.com domain. I'm going to view the properties of this to give you an idea of what we're looking at here. The nuggetlab.com domain is an authoritative domain, and it is used so that you can deliver email to recipients in that organization. You could alternatively, and you wouldn't want to do this with your primary domain, with your nuggetlab.com, but any of these secondary domains, you could create those also as authoritative domains or as relay domains, essentially relaying those mail out from an internal basis, from an external basis, to other people, to other devices, to other locations. So remember, an accepted domain is used when you want to identify a domain that is acceptable to receive mail as. Again, let's go back to our example before where nuggetlab.com bought contoso.com, right? If the contoso.com is indeed a domain that people have email addresses for, other people out in the world have bob@contoso.com, and they still want to be able to send mail to contoso.com, right? And you want to be able to receive it and route it to the right person inside, well, you will put this as an accepted domain, right? Internally, you may be dealing with some other elements. You may be need to create some other alternate email addresses. You may need to deal with some other things inside to be able to route this to the right person. But this is how you will instruct those servers to at least receive the mail so it can be routed correctly. So this is just one of those steps involved. If we want to receive mail for contoso.com here's the accepted domain name. We want to choose this as an authoritative domain, again, because in this example we've bought contoso.com and we are considered authoritative for contoso.com. We could also use it as a relay if we wanted to. If we click the new button here, that's going to create that additional accepted domain. And now I will be able to receive email from whomever at contoso.com. Lastly is this concept of remote domains. Recall that a remote domain is an SMTP domain that's external to your Exchange organization. It's used to define those settings for message transfer between your organization and someone else outside of your Active Directory forest. Now, by default, you have a policy for remote domains, essentially the star domain, which is everybody else. And that policy essentially says that for everyone else, you're going to allow external out-of-office messages only. Remember, as I talked about before, this is some of this more rich content that you would use in defining that, how you would handle out-of-office stuff. Now, you can allow no out-of-office messages if you wanted to. A lot of organizations don't want to forward out-of-office messages outside of their organization because it becomes a way for would-be spammers to get hard IP addresses. So you can potentially say, outside of our organization, I don't want to deliver any of those out-of-office messages. Or I could allow external out-of-office messages and legacy out-of-office messages of various different types. If I'm sending mail, I can choose some of the message format for how I'm sending that mail as well. Do I want to allow automatic replies or forward? Do I want to allow delivery reports or NDRs, for example, display sender name on messages, etc., etc.? Do I want to allow Exchange rich text format, which sometimes some organizations want to convert all of their email outbound so that they use, for example, a regular text format? So these are the properties you would use for those external domains. You can create another new remote domain if you want. Remember that whole contoso.com acquisition we were talking about? If we had contoso.com, perhaps it wasn't necessarily that we were receiving contoso.com, but instead we wanted to send mail to contoso.com with some additional characteristics. We could do so by creating that contoso.com remote domain and then applying some of these characteristics to that remote domain here. You probably wouldn't want to do a remote domain and an accepted domain to the same name here. You probably have different use cases for both, so we're going to go ahead and remove this for now. But it gives you an idea for why you would create those remote domains here inside of the Exchange Management Console. Now the last little trick I want to show you here, and this is kind of an aside, but it's just kind of a neat little tool that comes in handy when you're going through the administration of your Exchange server. This is down here under the toolbox, and what I want to take a look at here is the queue viewer. And the queue viewer allows you to manage some of those Exchange mail queues, and it comes up as an MMC console, and it takes a look at the available mail queues. Now the idea here with this queue viewer is that it provides a mechanism for helping you troubleshoot when you've got mail backing up. Right? Maybe somebody's sending out 500 messages every second, and your server can't handle the load, and so the mail is taking far too long to actually be queued outbound whenever it's being sent. Well, the queue viewer helps you take a look at the different queues that are available, and even potentially the messages that are in those queues to identify, well, who's causing the problem, or why is the problem occurring. You can see here that under submission, we have a delivery type of undefined. The queue is ready. There are currently 0 messages in the queue. Now, I don't have any clients that are actually working with this domain right now. My Windows 7 client is, not sending any messages currently. So our queue is going to be relatively small. But once we have this queue, if we have, especially a large organization, we can take a look at this queue, potentially even view the individual messages in this queue also, to get a little more information about what's going on with the transfer of mail in our organization. Again, very handy little troubleshooting tool when it comes to this whole mail transport concept for helping you identify when you've got some problems. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about the whole process of the hub transport server and really kind of the core processes, I think I'll say, the transport, the message transport things that you need to know just to simply get your organization up and running. We talked about connectors. We talked about routing mail inside of the Active Directory forest and also those special connectors that are used for routing mail outside of the Active Directory forest. And then we talked about Edge subscriptions just a little bit, which we'll focus a little bit more on when we talk about the Edge transport role. And then this concept of accepted and remote domains for some of those special cases. Lastly, we talked about this queue viewer utility, which is a nice little troubleshooting tool for helping you identify when your queues are backing up. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.